Hi everyone, welcome to another how-to video for the ACES program. This video is about managing heating controls. This is about gas or oil boilers, which many of you will have in schools, and they are typically configured in this way. You have the boiler in a boiler room very often, or several boiler rooms, and it outputs heat through wet pipework, the arrow to radiators. When you turn it on in the first thing in the morning or whenever it comes on, it will go out to the radiators and circulate around a number of them before that hot water, much less hot at that point, returns to the boiler to be reheated and sent around again. Typically, the output temperature ranges from about 60 degrees Celsius to 80 degrees Celsius, 72 degrees Celsius being the most common output temperature. And if you bought a boiler brand new, it would be at about 90% efficiency. So that means how efficiently it's turning its fuel into energy. So for every 1 unit of input, it's turning about 90% of that, so 0.9 into a heat output. So some things that affect how heat works. The master controls for a heating system, I should say, are usually on off, or some of you will have that labeled in a boiler room as summer winter. There are also heating times. So these are blocks of time that you may have set or someone else may have set in the school for when the heating is active to a particular temperature. That temperature is then controlled by a thermostat, i.e. generally when that temperature is reached, the heating switches off, or it certainly tries to. There are other factors that affect how you control heating. So in this image on the, just out of view actually on the left of the image is the radiator flow valve. This is not set by you, it's usually set at time of installation, and it controls how much hot water flows through the radiator. The reason being, if you remember the diagram on the previous section, the very first radiator gets the hottest water and slowly that temperature drops. And so in order to have about a consistent output throughout the circuit of radiators, the valve there would be adjusted using a special tool. You won't normally touch these in a school. The second, which is actually missing in this video on the right-hand side, is the thermostatic radiator valve. These are usually labeled something like 0 to 6 rather than specific temperatures. And the idea is that they can make the radiator hotter or slightly cooler in local rooms. Finally, worth mentioning is some of you, not all of you, may have different heating zones. That is, different circuits of radiators that exit from the boiler room. Sometimes 2, 3, or even 4 zones might come off of one single boiler room. We'll talk about those more in the next slide. So this gives an overview of the controls that you have. So it's not all about the TRVs. There are lots of other things to consider to control heating. So where can controls and how you manage them save on heating? And keeping in mind here, we're not talking about uncomfortable. We're talking about keeping the schools comfortable, most specifically when there are users, staff and students at the school. So the first point is that if the heating is on too early in the morning or too late in the evening before there's anyone on site, then there's the potential for wasted heating. So the idea is to set times to match occupancy. The second is that the thermostat might be set too high. Now, there's a lot of reasons why a cold or a series of cold rooms in the school might result in you turning the thermostat up a little bit. But if there are constantly overheating periods in the school, then it's worth revisiting. Equally, if your heating is on the weekends or overnight each night, then the heat is being wasted. It's simply going out the windows and walls of the school because nobody's there to use it. Third point here is that if you do have rooms that are overheating because of the heating itself, and the remedy to that has been to open the windows in that room to make it more comfortable for users, it would be very helpful to reduce the TRVs because that hot temperature in the wet system is then passed on to the next room rather than going out the window, quite literally. Finally, final point here, the heating zones, if you have them, exist because they allow separate control, both time and temperature. So it's worth reviewing these if you do have zones to see that they're set appropriately. For example, if you have one room being used out of hours for meetings, say it's 7 in the evening, and the 3 zones of the school are all being heated to that late in the evening, you could potentially turn 2 of those zones to switch off, say at 3 p.m. and only heat till 7 p.m. in a smaller area. A final point for this workshop is about the relationship you might have with the heating engineer. That's usually a third party that comes and does maintenance on the boiler. They may only come once or twice a year, or if you have a more intimate relationship because they need to come on site more often, you might see your heating engineer several times a year. First point before we go into this, however, is that the idea of turning your heating off overnight can sometimes be at odds with what heating engineers are aiming to do. And sometimes it is okay to heat into the early hours of the morning to get the school warm for the following day. But generally speaking, if it's more than about 5 or 6 hours before any users will arrive, at least a large portion of the heat from a heating system being left on is going out through the building. So it is worth talking in more detail to a heating engineer about that to try and reduce waste. Other ways that you might be able to save energy with interacting with your heating engineer, if you can't review the controls in your heating system at the school, they will know how to access this. If they're going to charge you for this, which they sometimes do, it may be worth writing down exactly how you access the heating controls so you can review those times and set temperatures and indeed change them on your own. Second point here is that heating engineers, when they carry out maintenance, can also additionally look to see about improving the efficiency of how the boiler is combusting its fossil fuels and the efficiency thereof. Again, there's usually a charge to do that as an extra thing, but it's well worth doing if it's not been carried out in the school. Final point, if the thermostats in the school or anything that's measuring temperature, whether it's inside the boiler or on a wall somewhere in the school, has never been tested and it's somewhat old, it is worth asking for these to be tested for accuracy. They can become inaccurate by 2, 3, or even 4 degrees Celsius, which affects not only overheating in the school, but the efficiency of the whole system. So, a summary of what we've talked about. Identify your school's heating systems and its controls. Specifically, find out the heating times, the set temperature, how the thermostatic radiator valves are managed, and also if you have any heating zones and what the settings are for those. Review the settings that you have to find reductions, find times when you can reduce the temperature. Again, not without compromising, not with compromising the comfort. You want to keep the comfort the same. You just want to find wastage there. Address any rooms that overheat because of the heating system. Sometimes that might be rebalancing the radiator or just using the TRV before windows are open. If you have heating zones, see if you can decide if there are any better settings for some of those zones based on occupancy. And finally, if you catch the heating engineer or want to have a discussion with them, make sure that occasionally there's some efficiency check on the boiler itself, and that maybe the temperature sensors are checked for accuracy once every year or 2 or 3. That's the end of this how-to video. If you have any questions or are interested in more from the ACES support, please visit the website where you can find contact details for us. And thank you for listening.